There's a moment, and most people never talk about it, when you're bone-tired, sun-scorched, running behind on everything that matters, and something stops you cold. Not a person, not a crisis you were trained for, not even something you can explain to anyone later without getting a sideways look. Just a donkey, standing in the middle of nowhere, looking at you like she already knows you're her last option. This is the story of a cowboy named Dell Hatcher who stopped his truck on a dying stretch of Sonoran Road with $200 left in his account, a cattle lease 3 days from expiring, and more problems than a man should carry alone. He got out of that truck anyway. He walked toward the heat instead of away from it. What he found wasn't just a collapsed animal. It was a Jenny and her foal and an old Jack who'd been walking since before sunrise. What he did next didn't make headlines. Nobody filmed it. The county extension office never wrote a report. But the Apache elder who watched him from a ridge a quarter-mile away, a man named Teofilo Runningwater who hadn't spoken a word of English to a white man in 11 years, watched every single minute. And on the 3rd day, Teofilo came down. This story isn't about heroism. It's about what happens to a man when he decides that something small and suffering matters more than everything falling apart around him, and what that decision costs, and what it quietly gives back. Stay with it, the desert doesn't rush, neither should you. I keep a field log, have for 11 years. Nothing fancy, a wire-bound notebook, the kind you buy in a pack of 3 from a gas station display rack. The cover's already warping by the time you get home because you left them on the dash. I write in it mostly at night, after the animals are settled and the day has collapsed down to just the sound of desert wind and whatever is rattling loose on the barn roof. My handwriting is terrible. My wife used to say I wrote like a man who learned from a doctor who learned from a fence post. She wasn't wrong. I write things down because I forget the small stuff otherwise, the color of the sky on a specific morning, the way a particular calf stood in the rain, the exact temperature, not what the weather app said, but what my body said. My body has its own thermometer. It reads in things like bad and worse, and we are past the point of normal human endurance. Please reconsider your choices. The morning I saw the donkeys, my body was reading worse. It was the 12th of June. I know because I wrote it down that night with a hand that still shook slightly. 12 June, 106 degrees by 9:40 in the morning. Wind off the Sonoran flats that didn't cool anything. It just moved the heat around, redistributed it, the way a bad card dealer shuffles the same losing hand into a new order that still loses. I was driving a 2008 Ford F-250 with a driver's side window that only rolled down to the halfway point, and an air conditioning compressor that had died sometime in March, and that I had not replaced because replacing it cost money I did not have. I had $214 in my checking account. I remember the number because I'd checked it on my phone at the gas station in Bowie, 40 minutes back. Buying coffee with exact change I counted from my shirt pocket because my wallet was somewhere in the truck seat, and I didn't want to dig for it in front of the kid at the register who was maybe 19 and already looked more put together than me. The number $214 had sat in my chest like a swallowed stone all morning. Not panic, something worse than panic. The dull, fluorescent weight of knowing exactly how far gone things were. The cattle lease on the Pendergast parcel was up on the 15th, 3 days. And the Pendergast family, specifically the youngest brother, Gary, who'd taken over the books after the old man passed, had made it clear enough in the tone of his voicemails that the lease wasn't renewing unless I came in with a check for the back amount plus 2 months forward. $1,400. I had $214. The arithmetic was not complicated. I was driving out to the parcel because 3 of my cows had drifted, which happens when fences go unwalked, and I'd been too strung out on other problems to walk them regular. Drifted cows were the kind of problem that had its own timeline and didn't care about yours. I had to find them, move them, get them counted, and figure out somewhere else to graze if the Pendergast deal collapsed, which it was going to, unless something I wasn't thinking of happened between now and Thursday. That's the state I was in. That's the specific gravity of the morning. The road out to the parcel is a caliche track, white desert limestone packed and graded by whoever built it sometime in the 60s, now crumbling at the edges where the flash rains had undercut it. You can see about a mile ahead on the flat stretches before the track curves toward the low hills. It's the kind of road that teaches you patience by removing every alternative. You go the speed the road allows or you don't go. I saw them at just past the half-mile mark. At first, I thought it was debris. The desert does strange things to distance. Objects flatten out, colors bleed into each other, the eye lies. I thought it was a piece of tarp, maybe, or some washed-out trash from an illegal camp. The flats out here get used. People cross at night and leave things behind, water jugs, clothing, sometimes things that are harder to look at. I found all of it at one point or another over the years, and I have learned a kind of practiced numbness to it, the way you learn not to flinch at the sight of certain tools after enough work. But then the debris moved. A leg, gray-brown, nobbled at the knee. It lifted, shook, and dropped back to the ground with the kind of exhaustion that is indistinguishable from surrender. I stopped the truck. I sat for probably 40 seconds without moving, engine idling, looking at the thing in the road ahead of me. My field log was on the passenger seat. I don't know why I noticed that. Probably because I was not yet ready to make a decision, and the brain casts around for irrelevant things when it's stalling. Then I got out. The heat hit me the way heat always hits you when you've been inside any enclosure, even a bad one, a full-body press, like walking into something solid. My boots raised small puffs of caliche dust with every step. The sun was high enough that my shadow was almost directly underfoot, a small dark puddle I was dragging with me. There were 3 of them. The Jenny was down. She had collapsed on her side about 6 feet off the road on the flat hardpan, and she was breathing. I could see the heave and fall of her rib cage from 20 feet, but the rhythm was wrong, too fast, too shallow, the kind of breathing that's doing the work of just staying alive and nothing more. She was grayed uncolored, darker on the legs and face, with a narrow blaze of pale fur that ran from between her eyes almost to her muzzle. Her eyes were open. She looked at me when I came close, and she did not move, which told me almost everything I needed to know about what condition she was in. The foal was pressed against her flank. I put it at maybe 4 months old, maybe 5, upright, but unsteady, leaning into the Jenny like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. It was smaller than you'd expect, thin-legged, with enormous dark eyes that blinked at me with an expression I can only describe as bewildered hope. It made no sound, just watched me, pressed against its mother, its tiny ribcage working in the same too-fast tempo as hers. The jack was standing about 15 feet away, facing roughly north, and he was the one that stopped me completely. He was old, I could tell from the gray around his muzzle, the slight sway in his back, the way his front legs were planted wide to compensate for something in his balance that wasn't working the way it used to. He was not collapsed. He was standing by an act of will so obvious it was almost visible, like you could see the effort written on him in a language that didn't need words. His head hung low. His ears, long, expressive, funneled toward me, were half-dropped, which in a healthy donkey means relaxed, but in this one meant something else. Means too tired to hold them straight. Means we have come as far as we can come, and this is where we are. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked back at the Jenny. I pulled out my phone. I had 1 bar of service, which was 1 more than I usually have out here. I called my neighbor Reg Castellan, who runs cattle on the parcel adjacent to mine, and who has a water tank on a trailer that he uses for his own animals in the dry season. I owe Reg more favors than I can count. We are past the point of keeping track. "I need your water trailer," I said when he picked up. "Out on the Pendergast Caliche Road, about 1.5 miles past the cattle guard." "Dell," there was noise in the background, the sound of a tractor. "Yeah. What for?" "Donkeys, 3 of them. They're in bad shape." A pause. "Your donkeys?" "No. Somebody's. I don't know whose." Another pause. "How bad?" I looked at the Jenny. She blinked. The foal shifted its weight against her with a small, trembling motion, like a child adjusting in sleep. "Bad enough that I stopped," I said. Reg knows me. He knows what that means. I don't stop for things. I'm not built that way. I was raised ranching by a man who believed that sentiment about animals was the first step toward poor financial decisions, and I've spent 32 years agreeing with him most of the time. I stop for equipment failures and weather. I stop for my animals. I stop for very little else, and both Reg and I know this. "Give me 40 minutes, he said. I hung up and walked back to my truck and got my water jug, a 5-gallon plastic container I keep behind the seat, half full, which I had been planning to use for the cattle. I carried it over to the Jenny and crouched down next to her. Up close she smelled of sweat and dust, and something underneath that, something organic and sharp. the smell of a body working beyond its designed parameters. I poured water into my cupped hand and held it near her muzzle. She didn't drink at first, just breathed. Her nostrils flared at the smell of the water, but she didn't move her head. "I know," I said. "I don't know why I said it. I'm not a man who talks to animals as a rule. My wife used to, and I teased her for it, and she'd tell me I was missing the point of the whole thing. I think maybe she was right. I think maybe you have to get to the end of your own resources before the point of certain things becomes clear." I held my hand there. The sun came straight down on the back of my neck. After a minute, she drank. It wasn't much, a few mouthfuls, lips moving against my palm with a delicacy that seemed absurd given the circumstances, gentle as a prayer. But she drank. And the foal watched, and then the foal came forward, and I poured water into my other hand, and the foal drank too, its small muzzle tickling my fingers, its breath warm and rapid against my skin. I looked up at the jack. He had turned to watch us. His ears had come up slightly, not all the way, but up, tracking toward us. I walked over to him with the jug and poured some directly onto the ground in front of him, in a low spot in the hardpan where it pooled instead of running off. He lowered his head and drank from the ground with a methodical steadiness that was the first thing I had seen all morning that looked like dignity. I went back to my truck and sat in the half-shade of the open door and wrote 3 lines in my field log. 12 June, found them on the Pendergast Road. Jenny down, foal, old Jack, don't know whose, Reg coming with water. Then I sat and waited and didn't think about the lease or the $214 or the 3 missing cows, because some things have a way of temporarily erasing other things, and this was one of them. The thing about the desert is that silence here is not the absence of sound. It's a specific sound, layered, textured, alive with things you don't usually notice. The low static of heat shimmer, which somehow you can almost hear. The occasional creak of a mesquite branch swelling in the sun. The distant dry rattle of something moving through brush, too small to see. In the 40-some minutes before Reg arrived, I became aware of all of it with a sharpness I don't usually have. Because when you're sitting still in the desert waiting for something, the desert fills in. The Jenny's breathing had slowed slightly, still too fast but less frantic than before. The foal had settled down beside her, pressed against her belly with its legs tucked, its head raised, watching everything. Every time I moved even slightly, those enormous dark eyes tracked me with an attention that felt almost accusatory, like it was deciding something about me and hadn't finished yet. The jack hadn't moved from his spot 15 feet away. He was doing the thing that old animals sometimes do when they are very tired, standing absolutely still with a quality of stillness that is different from normal stillness. Deeper, like all the energy that usually goes into small adjustments and shifts has been deliberately conserved for the one thing that matters, which is continuing to stand. I walked over to him twice more with water. The second time I let him drink from my hands instead of the ground, because the ground water had gone and I'd run the jug down to the last inch or so. He drank with the same careful steadiness, his lips moving against my palms, his long face up close to mine. He smelled of heat and old sweat, and something else I couldn't name, not unpleasant, something almost mineral, the smell of a creature that has been doing hard things for a very long time. I found myself looking at his eyes. People say animals don't have complex inner lives, and I am in no position to argue one way or the other, but I know what I saw in those eyes, and what I saw was fatigue so deep it had passed through exhaustion and come out the other side into something that looked, if I'm honest, like stubbornness. Not hope, not despair, stubbornness. The refusal, even at the outer edge of what a body can do, to simply lie down. He was standing because he had decided to stand, and that decision was not going to change. I put my hand on his neck. He didn't flinch, he just breathed. I stood there with my hand on an old jack donkey on a white caliche road in 106 degrees and thought about my father. I don't know why. Maybe because stubbornness was his language too. Maybe because the old man spent 40 years making decisions that cost him something and kept making them anyway, and I spent a long time not understanding that about him. And maybe now, standing here with my palm against this animal's dry coat, I was beginning to. The field log, if you look at that night's entry, reads, "Old Jack is stubborn, the real kind, the kind that costs. Reg arrived at 11:22. I know because I checked my phone when I heard the truck. He pulled up in his GMC with the water trailer bouncing behind him, the tank not full but close enough to matter. He got out and took one look at the Jenny and said, 'Lord have mercy,' which coming from Reg, a man who reserves profanity for equipment failures and sympathy for almost nothing, meant he understood the situation. We worked together. We've worked together enough times that we don't need to talk much, just nod and fall into the task. Reg got a collapsible trough out of his truck box, and we filled it from the trailer and positioned it near the Jenny's head. She drank more this time, real drinking, sustained, the way a thirsty animal drinks when the water is steady and available, and something in them lets go of the alertness enough to focus entirely on the need. "Where'd they come from?" Reg asked, crouching next to her. "Don't know," I said. "No brands I can see, no tags." "Wild. Maybe, or lost, or abandoned." I didn't say the third one with any particular feeling, but it landed between us with weight anyway. Abandoned is a word that means something specific out here, where people sometimes leave animals because they've lost the ability to care for them, not from cruelty, usually, but from the same kind of arithmetic that had me checking my account balance at a gas station that morning. Resources run out, choices narrow. Things that were once cared for get left in places where maybe someone else will find them. "Well," Reg said, he scratched the side of his jaw, "we can't leave them." "No," I said, "we can't." We got the Jenny to her feet eventually. It took both of us and about 20 minutes of patient coaxing, of water and slow, careful repositioning, of letting her find her own balance against us without forcing it. When she finally stood, she stood trembling, all four legs working separately against the ground like she was reminding each one of its job. But she stood. The foal immediately pressed against her flank, and the Jenny lowered her head to sniff it, a gesture so instinctively maternal I had to look away for a second. The Jack watched all of it. He had not moved from his original position. When the Jenny was standing, his ears came all the way up for the first time. He took 3 steps toward her and stopped. I wrote in my log that night, he waited until he knew she was okay before he moved. I don't know what to do with that information. I still don't. The problem once they were watered was what to do with them. My own place, a 12-acre parcel outside Wilcox, has a corral, 2 stock tanks, and a small pole barn I built myself over 2 summers with material I bought a little at a time. It's not much. It was built for cattle, not burros, and the fencing isn't high, and the forage situation in June is what it always is in the Sulphur Springs Valley in June, which is to say, thin. But I had 12 acres, and I had a barn, and I had water, and what these animals had was the Caliche Road and the sun and nothing else. Reg helped me think through the logistics. His trailer was too small for 3 animals, but we could make 2 trips, Jenny and foal first, then the Jack. It would mean driving back out and losing most of the afternoon, which was the afternoon I'd planned to use searching for my drifted cattle. The drifted cattle were a real problem. The Jack and the Jenny and the foal were in front of me, and also a real problem. I made the decision that I always knew I was going to make, which is why I'm writing this down. I'm writing it down because decisions like this, the ones where you choose the thing in front of you over the thing that matters to your ledger, those are the decisions that define a thing about a person, and I am still figuring out what they define about me. We made the first trip. Jenny and foal loaded with less resistance than I expected, the Jenny nervous but cooperative, the foal simply doing what the Jenny did, that instinctive following so complete it was almost heartbreaking. I drove slow. Reg drove ahead with the water trailer to handle the road. On the second trip, the Jack loaded by himself. I opened the trailer gate and stepped back, and he looked at me for a long moment, that deep, fatigued, stubborn look, and then he walked in. He walked in like he'd done it before. Like he'd decided this was the next right thing, and there wasn't any point in making it complicated. I closed the gate and stood there for a second in the silence. Then I got in the truck and drove home. I didn't find my cows that day. Found 2 of them the next morning, which is another story. The third one, a black baldy I'd been watching for because she tends to find gaps, turned up on the wrong side of a fence 2 properties over, which meant a phone call and an apology and a small awkward negotiation that ended well enough but cost me another half day. The Pendergast lease, Thursday, was coming. I did not think about any of it that afternoon. I settled the donkeys in the corral, checked them over as best I could, no wounds I could find, just dehydration and heat exhaustion and the kind of bone-deep fatigue that needed time more than anything else. I put out hay, which I had some of. I filled both stock tanks. The Jenny drank again and then stood quietly with the foal beside her. And the jack stood on the other side of the corral and watched everything, and held himself upright with that same stubborn stillness. I sat on the top rail of the corral fence in the evening when the heat had finally dropped below 100, and I wrote in my log, "3 donkeys, don't know whose, don't know what comes next. Reg says I'm an idiot. He said it the way he says things he doesn't mean." The jack stood up all day. I don't know why that matters to me so much, but I keep seeing it, the way he decided, the way nothing in the world was going to change that decision. 12 June, worst day in recent memory. Also something else I don't have a word for yet. It was the 3rd paragraph that I read back 3 weeks later, when things had changed enough that I finally had words for it. But on the night of the 12th, I just sat on the fence rail until the stars came out, which in the Sulphur Springs Valley they come out all at once, a whole spill of them, the Milky Way unobstructed and so thick it looks solid, and I listened to the quiet sounds of 3 exhausted animals standing in my corral, and I felt, for reasons I cannot fully articulate, slightly less like a man drowning. Not saved, not fixed. Just slightly less like drowning. That's where part 1 ends, not with anything resolved because nothing was resolved. The lease was still expiring. The money was still $214. My cows were still somewhere in the desert. But the jack was standing in my corral, and his ears were up, and the Jenny was breathing right, and the foal was pressed against her flank sleeping like it had finally found the one place in the world where sleep was possible. I climbed down off the fence and went inside and ate a cold plate of rice and beans, and wrote 3 more lines in the log. Stars out, animals quiet. Called Reg to say thanks. He told me not to be stupid. I don't think I was. I should explain something about the ridge. There's a low basalt ridge that runs roughly east-west along the northern edge of the Pendergast parcel, maybe a 1/4 mile off the Caliche Road. From the road you can see it, but you don't pay it much attention because it's background, low and dark, and always there, like the horizon itself. I have driven that road hundreds of times over the 7 years I've leased the parcel, and I have rarely looked at the ridge the way you look at something that might contain a person. Reg told me about the man on the 3rd day. He came by in the morning. He does this sometimes, just drives by, a kind of informal check that neither of us acknowledges as what it is, which is friendship, and he leaned against my fence and looked at the donkeys for a while before he said it. "There's somebody watching your place," he said. I looked at him. "The ridge," he said, "north side. Saw him yesterday afternoon when I was running the fence line. Older fella, Apache, I think, didn't move, didn't do anything, just sat up there." "Watching what?" Reg tilted his head toward the corral. "Them." I stood for a moment trying to parse what that meant and failing. "You talked to him." "Didn't go up, figured it wasn't my situation." Which it wasn't. Reg is good that way. He draws the line between what involves him and what doesn't with a precision that I've always respected and occasionally envied. That afternoon, after I'd checked on the animals and done the necessary morning work, I drove out to the Pendergast parcel. Not for the cows this time. I'd gotten 2 of them back and the 3rd had been recovered, and I'd put all 3 in the smaller pasture behind my house as a temporary measure while I figured out the lease situation. I drove out to the parcel because of what Reg had told me. I parked on the road and looked at the ridge. Nothing. Just dark basalt and the pale desert sky above it and a scatter of saguaro along the upper edge standing like they were supervising something. I almost drove home. Instead, I sat in the truck for a while, writing in my log. I have a habit of writing when I'm stalling, which means the log has a lot of entries that are mostly me describing landscapes I'm not ready to engage with yet. That afternoon, I wrote about the color of the basalt, which is not black the way you'd think, but more of a very dark red-brown, almost burgundy in the right light. I wrote about the angle of the sun. I wrote about the way the saguaro look from a distance versus up close, which is a difference worth noting. And then I wrote, "Is there someone up there?" And then I got out of the truck. It took me about 20 minutes to climb to the top of the ridge, not because it was steep, but because the basalt is fractured and irregular and the footing requires attention, and because I am 43 years old and my right knee sends specific communications when I ask it to do things at inclines, communications that I have learned to receive and largely ignore. By the time I reached the upper edge, I was breathing hard, and my shirt was soaked through. And I had, objectively speaking, made several decisions that reasonable people would question. He was there. He was sitting on a flat section of basalt near the eastern end of the ridge, in a patch of shade thrown by a large saguaro. He was old, older than I'd expected from Reg's description, or maybe the description had failed to convey what old really looked like up here, which was settled. The way certain rock formations look settled. Not passive, not weak, just arrived. Like something that had decided on its location and then arranged itself permanently around that decision. He was a compact man, dark-skinned with deep lines across his face and hands that rested on his knees with a stillness that reminded me of the Jack. Not relaxed exactly. Deliberate. He had gray-white hair pulled back, and he was wearing a plain, dark shirt and work pants, and he held a cloth hat in his hands that he wasn't wearing. He looked at me the way people look at things they've been expecting. I said, "Afternoon." He said nothing. I stood there for a moment at the edge of the flat section and let the silence be what it was. I'm not great at silence. My default response to it is to fill it, which is a tendency I've been working on with mixed results. My field log has a note from about a year back that reads, "Stop talking when silence is the right answer." I read it back sometimes as a reminder. I sat down on the basalt a few feet away from him, not close, respectful distance, the kind of distance that says I'm here but I'm not demanding anything. I looked out toward my property, which from up here was visible as a small cluster of structures in the middle of a large tan and green landscape. You could see the corral clearly. Even from this distance, if you knew what to look for, you could see the 3 animals inside it. We sat for probably 5 minutes without speaking. Then he said, in English that was slow and deliberate and carried the weight of someone who has thought carefully about what language to use, "The Jenny, she walking yet?" I looked at him. He was looking at the corral. "Yes," I said. "She was on her feet by this morning. She's still weak, but she's moving around." He nodded once slowly. "The foal," he said. "Foal's good," I said. "Hungry but good. I've been supplementing with some feed I had." Another nod, still looking at the corral. "Old Jack," he said. I thought about the Jack, about the way he'd stood on the road all morning by sheer decision, about the way his ears had come up when the Jenny got to her feet, about the way he'd walked into the trailer by himself, quietly, as if he'd simply resolved to do the next right thing. "Standing," I said. "He doesn't stop standing." The old man turned and looked at me for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, clear, and they looked at me with an attention I wasn't quite prepared for. The kind of attention that sees more than you're offering. He said he never does. A pause. "You know him?" I said. It wasn't a question. "His name is Oso," the man said. "The Jenny is Paloma. The foal doesn't have a name yet." I sat with that for a moment. "They're yours," I said. He looked back at the corral. "They were my wife's," he said. "She kept them for 30 years. Paloma is the daughter of Paloma, who was the daughter of the first Paloma. The Jack Os, he has been here since before I married her." A pause. "My wife passed in April." I said, "I'm sorry." He acknowledged this with a small movement of his head that was not quite a nod. "When she passed, I moved to my nephew's place. The animals, I left them with a neighbor. The neighbor had problems of his own, and they got loose. I didn't know until 2 days ago when the neighbor called." He paused again. The silence this time was different, heavier, shaped around something it was holding. "I came when I found out," he said. "I found their tracks on the road. I followed them. I found the place where Paloma went down." He looked at me steadily. "And I found where you stopped." I looked at the ground between my boots. The basalt was warm under my palms. "You watched," I said. "Yes. For 3 days. Yes." "Why didn't you—" I stopped. I was going to say come down, but the question answered itself as I was forming it. He'd been watching to see what I was, what kind of person stops, what kind of person keeps stopping. He said, "In my experience, men stop for animals and then they look for who owns them. And when they find who owns them, sometimes things change." "What things?" He looked at me again with that clear, measuring gaze. "Whether the animal is still there when you arrive." I understood what he was saying. I have heard stories on this land about how things work sometimes, about how property claimed by someone with less recourse than you can become unclaimed very quickly when there's no one watching. I am not immune to those stories. I grew up in communities where those stories were adjacent to people I knew, and I know what they cost and what they leave behind. Oso and Paloma and the foal are in my corral, I said. That's all I was planning on doing with them, keeping them until I figured out whose they were. He looked at me for a long time. I didn't look away. Some conversations require that you not look away, and you know which ones they are when you're in them. Finally, he said, I know, he paused. I've been watching since the first day. His name was Teofilo Runningwater. He told me this without ceremony, the way you tell someone your name when you've already decided something about them. He was 71 years old. He had been born on the San Carlos reservation and lived most of his adult life between San Carlos and the small parcel his wife Esperanza had owned outside Duncan, which is where the donkeys had been kept. He had been watching my place for 3 days because he needed to know what kind of man I was before he came down. That's what he said. He said it without apology, as a plain statement of fact, and I received it the same way because it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. We sat on the ridge for about an hour. He talked more than I expected, or maybe I expected the wrong things. He talked about Esperanza, not with the crumbling emotion of fresh grief, but with the particular precision of someone who has been thinking about a person so continuously that the thoughts have worn smooth, like river stones. He described her the way you describe a landscape you know so well you can navigate it in the dark. Her hands, the way she named every animal she kept. The 30-year habit of the morning feeding, which she had done in all weather, in all health, until 6 weeks before she died. She would talk to them, he said, Paloma and Oso especially, long conversations. About what? I said. He looked faintly amused. I never asked, it seemed private. I thought about my wife who talked to animals. I thought about teasing her for it. I thought about the word private and what it costs you to violate the private things of someone you love, even in small ways, even when you think you're being funny. My wife did that too, I said. He looked at me. She passed 3 years ago, I said. He nodded once, the same slow, acknowledging nod that said, I understand. I understand completely, and I don't need to say more than that. We sat quietly for a while after that. Below us, in my corral, Paloma moved slowly around the perimeter fence, and Oso stood in the corner with his ears up, and the foal followed Paloma step for step, like a small shadow with opinions. Teofilo watched them the way you watch things that cost you something. I can't take them back yet, he said eventually. I'm at my nephew's place and there's no room, no fence, no water for animals. They can stay, I said, as long as you need. He looked at me, that same measuring look. I don't have money to offer, he said, for the feed or the water. I didn't ask for money, I said. I know you didn't, a pause. I'm telling you the situation. The situation is they're safe, and they have feed and water, and I have room, I said. That's the whole situation. Another long pause. Below us, the foal stopped following Paloma and turned to look at Oso, as if checking on him, and Oso lowered his big gray head in the foal's direction, a gesture so small and complete that it was almost unbearable to watch. Teofilo made a sound, not a laugh exactly, but something soft and involuntary, a sound that escaped from whatever place he was keeping his grief. He caught it quickly, put it back. The foal needs a name, he said quietly. What would Esperanza have named her? He considered this seriously, the way you consider a real question. Something with little in it, he said finally. She liked to name the young ones with Chiquita or Pequeña in some part of it, something that acknowledged what they were. He paused, but she grew into the name. They always did. The small ones became their names eventually. I looked at the foal, all long thin legs and enormous eyes, and the specific brand of trembling courage that belongs exclusively to young things in new situations. You could call her Luz, I said. I don't know where that came from. It means light. He looked at me, then he looked at the foal. Pequeña Luz, he said quietly, testing it. Below us, the foal turned and looked directly up at the ridge, as if she'd heard something. Yes, Teofilo said, just that, yes. He came down off the ridge with me, picking his way over the basalt with the care of a man who knows his body and negotiates with it honestly. We drove back to my place in my truck in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. He walked to the corral fence and put his hands on the top rail and stood there for a long time while Oso walked slowly over to him and put his gray muzzle against Teofilo's hands and stood very still. I went inside and gave them time. This felt correct. Some reunions don't need a witness. When I came back out 20 minutes later with 2 glasses of water, Teofilo was sitting on the ground against the outside of the corral fence with his back against the rails and Oso's big head resting over the top rail directly above him, and they were simply present together. Not doing anything. Just being in the same space, the way 2 people who know each other well can sit without talking, and it doesn't mean anything except that they know each other well. I sat down a few feet away and handed him one of the glasses, and we drank water together in the shade of the afternoon and watched Paloma and Pequeña Luz move around the corral. And we didn't talk about anything for a while, and this is the entry I wrote in my log that night. His name is Teofilo Runningwater, 71 years old. He watched from the ridge for 3 days because he needed to know what kind of person I was. I understand this. I would have done the same. Oso went straight to him. Of course he did. The foal has a name, Pequeña Luz, because Esperanza always named the young ones with something small that they grew into. He's going to need a place for the animals eventually. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what my situation looks like in 3 days. I don't know much of anything. But he came down off that ridge. That matters. Something about a man who waits until he's sure before he comes down, that matters to me in ways I'm not ready to articulate yet. June 14th, tomorrow is the lease. The call from Gary Pendergast came at 7:42 in the morning on the 14th. I was in the barn doing the early feed, and my phone buzzed in my shirt pocket, and I looked at it and felt the familiar stone drop of the $214 number and answered anyway because not answering was not actually an option, just a feeling. Dell, Gary said. He has a voice that sits somewhere between businesslike and apologetic, which I have come to understand is just how he is. A man uncomfortable with the practical consequences of his own decisions. Gary, I said. About the lease, he said. I know, I said. I don't have the full amount. I want to be straight with you about that. A pause. I know you don't, he said. That's actually I wanted to call before you came in. My brother called me last night. Another pause. Mitchell. Mitchell was the middle Pendergast brother, the one who'd been mostly absent from the property management since their father died, working somewhere in the construction sector in Phoenix. I knew of him. I didn't know him. He called about you, Gary said. I stood in my barn and held the phone. Okay, I said. He has a friend, I didn't know this, but he has a friend on the Apache side of the valley who apparently saw something this week. Heard something. Gary paused again. He is a man who approaches difficult sentences cautiously, the way you approach uncertain footing. He said you pulled 3 animals out of the desert and you've been feeding them on your own. Mitchell's friend, he said this is a person named Teofilo. Mitchell knows Teofilo's nephew. I didn't say anything. The reason I'm calling, Gary said, is that Mitchell wants to invest in the parcel, has for a while, but Dad and I never took him up on it. He called last night specifically because of this thing with the donkeys and this man Teofilo. A pause. He said if a man does that for animals that aren't his, if a man does that when he's broke and behind on his lease, he's the kind of man you want on your land. I sat down on a hay bale. I don't know why. My legs just decided to do it. He wants to restructure the lease, Gary said. Longer term, lower monthly, first 3 months forgiven while we work out the terms. And he wants to discuss a water-sharing agreement if we go forward, because apparently there's some conversation happening about a windmill on the North Ridge, and the property lines get complicated. The North Ridge, the basalt ridge where Teofilo had sat for 3 days. I sat on the hay bale and looked at my hands. Dell, Gary said. I'm here, I said. I know this is a lot on short notice. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, but I didn't want you coming in with cash you don't have when the conversation is actually somewhere else. I said, I'll come in Friday. Friday's fine, Gary said. And Dell, what you did for those animals. Mitchell's friend told it a certain way. I don't know. I've been thinking about it since last night. I didn't do anything special, I said. Gary was quiet for a moment. Maybe not, he said, but apparently some people needed to see it. He hung up and I sat in the barn for a long time. My field log was in the house. I sat without it, which is unusual for me. When things happen that need recording, my instinct is to reach for the notebook. But I sat without it and let the thing settle the way sediment settles in still water, slowly and without being forced. What had happened was, a man on a ridge had watched me for 3 days. He had told someone, his nephew, probably, or just someone he trusted. And that person had told someone else. And somehow that chain had reached Mitchell Pendergast in Phoenix and come back around to me as a lease restructure on a Thursday morning in June, while I was feeding hay to someone else's donkeys in my barn. I do not know what to do with this, theologically or philosophically or in any other sense. I am not a man who believes in systems that reward virtue in direct and trackable ways. I have seen too many years of farming to believe that. I have watched careful men lose everything to weather and careless men prosper for reasons that had nothing to do with their choices. The world is not balanced. The ledger doesn't clear. And yet, there was a jenny collapsed on a caliche road. I stopped. I called Reg. I spent my afternoon and my water and my hay on animals that were not mine and that I had no practical reason to care for. And somehow that, not some grand act, not some sacrifice that cost me anything I can't recover, just the stopping, just the staying with it, had traveled outward in ways I couldn't have predicted or orchestrated. I am not writing this down to claim that virtue is rewarded. I'm writing it down because it happened, and I don't fully understand it, and the things I don't fully understand are the things most worth writing down. Teofilo came back that afternoon. He came in a different truck this time. His nephew's, I assumed, a newer model with good tires, and he wasn't alone. A younger man drove, maybe 30, with the Runningwater face in a younger iteration. He got out and nodded at me and introduced himself as Junior, not a nickname, apparently, just what everyone called him. And then he went to look at the animals while Teofilo and I stood by my fence. "I heard from my nephew this morning," Teofilo said. "I heard from the Pendergasts," I said. We looked at each other. Something passed between us that doesn't have a name. A recognition, maybe, of the strange geometry of how things move in a community, how information and trust travel along lines you can't always see until they arrive. "I didn't ask anyone to say anything," Teofilo said. He said it carefully, like he wanted to be sure I understood. "I know you didn't," I said. Junior told his employer. His employer knows Mitchell Pendergast. A pause. "It happens." "It does." He looked at the corral. Oso was watching Junior approach with those alert ears that I had come to think of as Oso's primary instrument of measurement. They tracked everything with a precision that made me think he understood more of what was happening than he let on. "There is a parcel," Teofilo said, "east of my nephew's place. Old grazing land abandoned maybe 10 years now. There's a hand-dug well that still has water we checked last year. Good fencing, old but solid." I waited. "Junior and I have been talking," he said, "about whether it could work for the animals, about whether something more permanent could be arranged." He paused. "There are 4 of Esperanza's family who have animals they can't properly keep where they are. A mule, 2 horses, another jenny. They need somewhere." I thought about the size of the parcel he was describing. I thought about my 12 acres and the pole barn and the 2 stock tanks. I thought about fencing, which is the kind of problem that has solutions if you have time and help. "I know fencing," I said. "I'm not fast, but I'm thorough." Teofilo looked at me. "Junior knows the owner of the abandoned parcel," he said. "He's been in contact. The man wants it used, but he's in New Mexico and can't manage it. A lease arrangement, something fair, might be possible." "For the animals," I said. "For the animals," he said. "And for whatever else makes sense." We stood there for a moment with the weight of an unfinished conversation, the kind that isn't finished because what comes next requires things that take longer than a single afternoon to arrange. I have been in enough of these conversations to know what they are. They're the beginning of something. They don't look like beginnings at the time. They look like 2 people standing at a fence talking about fencing, but they are. "I'll come look at the parcel," I said. Teofilo nodded. Junior had made it to the corral fence by now, and Oso had come over to investigate. Junior put his hand out flat, and Oso sniffed it carefully. And then, with the slow deliberation of a creature that does nothing without decision, Oso pressed his muzzle against Junior's palm and held it there. Junior laughed. It was a good laugh, surprised and genuine. Teofilo watched this, and something moved in his face, not a smile exactly, but the thing underneath a smile, the thing that makes smiling possible. Something that had been pressed down very hard for a long time, loosening slightly. Just slightly, just enough. "She would have liked that," he said quietly. "I didn't ask who, I knew who." I want to tell you that everything resolved cleanly after that. That the lease restructure went through without complication. That the abandoned parcel worked out. That the animals found their permanent home and Teofilo found some version of peace and my finances stabilized. And the geometry of the whole thing drew itself into a satisfying shape. Some of that happened eventually, but not cleanly and not quickly and not without cost. The lease restructure did go through. Friday meeting, 2 hours, Mitchell Pendergast on the phone from Phoenix. A new agreement signed with terms that gave me room to breathe for the first time in a year. The first 3 months forgiven, as Gary had said. The water-sharing conversation more complicated, involving surveyors and a county map and a meeting at the extension office that went 2 hours over schedule, but eventually resolved. The abandoned parcel was more complicated. The owner in New Mexico was willing in principle but slow in execution, and the lease arrangement took 11 weeks to finalize, involving Junior's employer as a guarantor and a hand-drawn map of the well location that had to be converted into a real survey before anyone would sign anything. I drove out there 4 times. I walked the fence line twice. On the second walk, I found 2 sections that needed full replacement and one that just needed tightening. And I drove back with a truck full of posts and wire and spent 3 weekends on it. Alone mostly, though Junior came the second weekend, and we worked through a morning in near silence, putting in posts in the hard caliche soil. And he said almost nothing, but he worked steadily and well. And when we broke for water in the midday shade, he told me about Esperanza the way you tell someone about a person they never met, carefully, selecting the right parts, because you want them to understand the real shape of who she was. She had kept animals her whole life. Goats before the donkeys, and a horse before that, and before all of them, as a girl, a long-eared dog that she had found injured on a road and taken home. Her family said the dog appeared the same week she was born and left the same week she died, which was obviously not literally true, but was true in the way that certain stories about certain people are true, not in fact but in meaning. She would stop for things, Junior said. He was looking at the horizon, not at me. Broken things, lost things, she said it was the same instinct. You see something that needs stopping for you stop. I thought about the Jenny on the Caliche Road. I thought about the moment, the 40 seconds in the truck, the brain casting around for irrelevant things while the real decision was forming. She would have liked you, Junior said. He said it the same way Teofilo had said it, looking at Osa with Junior's hand. The same register. Like it was true, but also like saying it was a small act of loyalty to someone no longer there to receive it. I didn't know what to say to that. So I picked up my post driver and went back to work, and Junior followed, and we spent the rest of the afternoon putting in fence posts without talking, which was the right way to spend it. Oso and Paloma and Pequeña Luz moved to the new parcel on the 23rd of August. The other animals came over the following 2 weeks as the arrangements were finalized. The mule, the 2 horses, the other Jenny. Teofilo drove out to the parcel on the first morning and stood inside the fence and watched them settle into the space, moving through it with the specific exploratory carefulness of animals in a new place, testing the perimeter, checking the well water, reading the geography with their hooves and their noses. I stood outside the fence. This felt right. It was his place, his animals, his morning. I had helped make it possible, and now it was time to stand outside it. He watched for a long time. Oso moved to the far end of the parcel, all the way to the north fence line, and stood there with his ears up looking out at the desert, at the flat horizon, at whatever he was reading out there. Then he turned and walked back at his slow, deliberate pace to where Paloma was grazing, and he stopped near her and stood again. He just stood. He had always just stood. Teofilo turned and looked at me through the fence. His eyes were clear. He had been crying, I think, sometime in the last hour. There was the faint trace of it around his eyes, but he wasn't now. He was just looking at me with that direct, measuring gaze. "Thank you," he said. "You don't have to thank me for anything," I said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." A pause. Esperanza would say that the animals knew, he said. She believed they knew which people would stop, some instinct. She said they could smell it, almost the kind of person who would stop. I looked at Oso, who was standing near Paloma with his ears up and his head slightly lowered, motionless as always, sentinel as always, the old stubborn quiet of him unchanged. "I don't know if that's true," I said. "No," Teofilo said. But I believe she was right. My field log from the 23rd of August. Moved the animals to the new parcel. Oso went to the north fence first. Of course he did. Checked everything, then came back. That's him. That's just him. Teofilo thanked me. I told him he didn't have to. He said he knew. The foal Pequeña Luz, she ran the whole length of the parcel twice. Just ran because she could, because there was space. I don't have a lesson for this. I don't have a moral. I stopped on a road in June and things happened from there. That's the whole story. Reg called tonight to ask how it went. I told him fine. He said good and hung up. That's Reg. I'm going to look at that parcel again next week about the west fence line. There's a section that needs work. Junior's coming. The stars tonight, same stars. I wrote one more thing that night at the bottom of the page after I'd set the log down and picked it up again, which is something I do when I'm not finished with a thought but don't know yet what the thought is. I wrote, she named the young one something small that they grew into. Pequeña Luz, little light. She was running today, the whole length of the parcel twice. I don't know what to conclude. I know that I stopped on the 12th of June, and I know what it cost me in time and water and hay, and I know what came back from it, and I know that the math of the two things doesn't really add up into a clean lesson about the universe. The universe isn't running that system. I know this from farming. But I also know what I saw on the north fence line on the 23rd of August. Oso standing, ears up, looking at the desert horizon. And Teofilo, watching him from the middle of the parcel with his hat in his hands. And Pequeña Luz running. The field log is on my kitchen table right now. The current page is mostly empty. I don't know what comes next. I don't think that's the problem I used to think it was.